I had been saving for months to finally take a break from work, and in the summer of 2014, I booked myself a week off to drive up north. I was 26 then, living alone in a small apartment in Dallas, and I wanted a change of pace from the routine of work, traffic, and noise. I decided to drive out to a quiet lake in Arkansas, a place I had only read about online. It wasn't a popular tourist spot, which was exactly what I wanted: peace and space away from people. The lake was about a 5-hour drive from my place. I left early in the morning and drove through long stretches of empty highways, small towns with quiet gas stations, and then finally the winding roads surrounded by thick woods. It was late June, hot and humid, with the air heavy and still. By the time I reached the entrance to the state park area, it was already early afternoon. The ranger booth was unmanned, and a wooden sign at the side of the dirt road read, "Camping area, 3 miles." I followed the narrow road, bouncing over potholes until I reached the clearing. The campground was basic, just a couple of fire pits, picnic tables, and flat dirt patches for tents. I only saw one other vehicle, an old silver pickup parked near the tree line. The bed of the truck was empty except for a blue tarp. No one was around. I figured maybe the owner was fishing down by the water. I set up my tent near the edge of the lake, where I had a clear view of the water through the trees. The lake itself was wide and still, the surface like a sheet of dark glass. The air smelled of pine and wet soil. As I hammered the stakes into the ground, I noticed a crow perched on a branch above me, watching. It cawed once, sharp and loud, and then flew off deeper into the trees. The first day was uneventful. I unpacked, lit a small fire, cooked some canned food, and spent most of the afternoon sitting by the shore. The silence was what struck me the most. Back in the city, there was always the sound of engines, sirens, or voices. Here, the only noise was the wind moving through leaves or the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. As the sun went down, the temperature dropped quickly. The other truck was still parked near the trees, but I hadn't seen anyone all day. I assumed maybe they had hiked deeper into the woods or even left their vehicle while fishing somewhere else. I told myself not to think too much about it. That night, I lay in my tent listening to the forest sounds. Crickets buzzed, frogs croaked near the water, but sometime past midnight I woke up. I wasn't sure why. My eyes opened to darkness, and I could hear nothing. No insects, no frogs, just silence. It was the kind of silence that makes your skin prickle. I stayed still, listening. Then I heard it, a slow crunch of footsteps on leaves. They were close, moving around my tent. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer or raccoon, but the steps were too steady, too careful. I held my breath. The steps circled the tent once, then stopped. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. I wanted to unzip the flap and look, but fear rooted me in place. After maybe a minute, the sound moved away, fading into the trees. I barely slept the rest of the night. At first light, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. Nothing seemed disturbed. No footprints I could clearly see in the dirt, though the ground was hard and dry. The silver pickup was still there, but I saw no person. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself maybe it really was just an animal. The second day, I went on a short hike. The trail was narrow, and in some places, roots and fallen branches blocked the way. I carried a small backpack with water and a snack. About 2 miles in, I found a clearing with some broken beer bottles and old firewood stacked up, signs that people had been there before. But what made me pause was the smell. It was faint but distinct, like something rotting. I didn't see any dead animal, but the odor hung in the air. It made me turn back toward camp earlier than planned. When I returned, I noticed something that froze me. My cooler, which I had left closed by the tent, was unlatched and slightly open. Nothing inside was missing, but it was clear someone had lifted the lid. Animals might have done it, but the latch was tight, not the kind you could open easily without hands. That night, I built a larger fire and sat close to it, trying to reassure myself. The flames flickered high, throwing long shadows on the trees. I ate quickly, then sat with my flashlight across my lap. Hours passed, and fatigue pulled at me. I crawled into the tent, but I kept the flashlight in my hand. Sometime deep in the night, I woke again. The fire outside had burned down to glowing embers, and the air inside the tent was stuffy. Then I heard it, the same sound as before. Footsteps, this time slower, closer, crunching carefully around the tent. My body locked with fear. I held the flashlight tight but didn't turn it on, afraid the beam would reveal me awake. The sound stopped right outside the flap of my tent. For several seconds, there was no movement. Then I heard the faintest sound, like fabric brushing, as if a hand touched the nylon of the tent. My mouth went dry. I didn't move, didn't breathe. After what felt like forever, the sound drifted away again, the steps moving back toward the trees. Morning came gray and damp. My nerves were shot. I decided I would pack up and leave. But when I walked over to my car, I stopped cold. On the driver's side window, faint but clear, was a handprint. Smudged, greasy, like someone had pressed their hand against the glass during the night. I knew for certain then it wasn't an animal. I didn't waste time. I broke down the tent in minutes, tossing things into the trunk without order. My hands shook as I worked, glancing over my shoulder again and again. The silver pickup was still there, unmoved, but I never saw anyone step out of it. It felt like eyes were on me from the trees the entire time. When I finally started the engine and pulled onto the dirt road, I kept checking my mirrors. The forest pressed close on both sides, dark and endless. After several miles, I reached the main road and only then let out the breath I'd been holding. I drove the entire 5 hours back without stopping, not even for gas until the tank was nearly empty. My body was running on pure adrenaline. By the time I made it back to Dallas, the sun was already setting again. In the days after, I kept replaying everything in my head. The footsteps, the cooler, the handprint. I wondered if someone had been living out there, watching the campground, waiting for people who came alone. The silver pickup haunted me the most. Always there, but no sign of its owner. I never went back to that lake. I never camped alone again. Even now, years later, when I think about it, I can still hear the sound of leaves crunching softly in the dark, circling where I slept. I had always wanted to see the Amazon with my own eyes, not through documentaries or photos, but to actually stand in it, breathe in the heavy air, and feel the ground beneath me. In 2014, when I was 29, I finally had the chance. A friend of mine had once worked in Brazil, and through him I learned about a small company that arranged guided treks into the rainforest. I didn't want a group trip though. I wanted to be alone to test myself. After some research, I figured out a way to arrange gear, food, and basic directions with a local contact in Manaus. It wasn't the safest plan, but the idea of camping alone in the Amazon pulled at me. The heat hit me immediately when I stepped into the jungle. It was different from any heat I had known before, thick, wet, and constant, like standing in a steam room that had no off switch. Every part of me was sweating within minutes, and every sound around me felt sharp. The noise never stopped. Birds, insects, things moving through leaves I couldn't see. The air smelled of mud, rotting plants, and something sweet but sour at the same time. I kept walking, stopping often to wipe my face, my backpack digging into my shoulders. By late afternoon, I had found a small patch of ground near a stream. It wasn't perfect. The earth was soft and damp, but it was flat, and I needed a place to rest. I set up my small tent, checked the straps, and laid out my sleeping bag inside. The ground felt uneven under me, but it would have to do. I boiled some water with my small stove, dropped in noodles, and ate them quickly while brushing ants off my legs. By the time the sun went down, the forest turned almost black. I zipped myself into the tent, telling myself I'd get used to the sounds. The first night was the hardest. The darkness felt different, like it was pressing in from every direction. I lay awake listening. Something moved near the stream, splashing lightly. Branches cracked in the distance. Insects buzzed right outside the thin tent walls. The heat never left, and I woke up every hour soaked in sweat, peeling my shirt off only to put it back on when the mosquitoes found me. In the morning, I stepped out to find fresh prints in the mud by the water. They were from something heavy, maybe a tapir or a wild pig. Couldn't be sure. The mud was churned, like whatever it was had been lingering. I tried not to think about it and filled my bottle with water after boiling it again. The second day, I tried to explore further down the stream, pushing through brush with my machete. Vines hung everywhere, some so thick they felt like ropes, others so thin they stuck to my skin like threads. Every step was slow. I stumbled over roots, slipped on mud, and swatted at clouds of mosquitoes. I found a wider section of the stream where the water was deeper, and I washed my face. Something moved under the surface, a flash of scales, and I stepped back quickly. I kept reminding myself I wasn't here for comfort. I was here to see what it felt like to be in this place, to know it for real. That night, I cooked rice and dried meat, trying to ignore the crawling feeling on my back. I checked the tent 3 times for holes. When I lay down, I noticed a faint light flashing outside. Fireflies drifting slowly through the air. I wanted to enjoy it, but my body stayed tense. On the 3rd day, I woke up to a strange sound. It wasn't the usual bird call or insect hum. It was low, steady, like breathing but deeper. I sat up fast, heart racing, listening. The sound stopped. I waited for several minutes, gripping the machete in my hand, but it didn't return. When I finally stepped out of the tent, I saw the same mud near the stream had new tracks. These were bigger than before, rounder, wider. I didn't want to guess what made them, but they weren't human. That day, I stayed closer to camp. I gathered wood, checked my gear, and sharpened the machete. I felt watched. Every time I looked up, I thought I saw movement, just leaves shifting, but always too quick, too sudden. My clothes were stiff with sweat and dirt, and my skin itched from bites. By the 4th night, I barely slept at all. I kept hearing the sound again, that low noise, somewhere out in the trees. Once it came closer. My whole body froze. I held my breath and pressed the machete across my chest. The sound of something heavy moving over leaves grew louder, then stopped. I waited, staring into the dark, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might give me away. Finally, it moved off again, fading slowly until I couldn't tell if I was imagining it. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay much longer. I was supposed to be out here for a week, but I knew I wouldn't last. The heat, the bugs, and now something I couldn't explain tracking me. It was too much. I packed slowly, listening, checking the mud again. The new prints were closer to the tent than before. I started back along the same path I came in. Moving felt harder, every noise sharper. The weight of the pack dragged me down, sweat blinding me. I stopped often to drink water, forcing myself to eat even when I wasn't hungry. By midday, I heard the sound again, behind me this time. I turned, gripping the machete, but saw nothing. Just the green wall of trees, endless and still. I kept walking faster now. The sound followed me for hours, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind. Not constant, but always there, reminding me I wasn't alone. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a jaguar or tapir, just curious. But the way it seemed to keep pace with me, stopping when I stopped, moving when I moved, made my chest tighten. As the light began to fade, I knew I wouldn't make it out before nightfall. I found another patch of ground and forced myself to set up the tent quickly, hands shaking, eyes darting at every noise. I didn't cook. I didn't want the smell to spread. I just drank water and laid flat inside, gripping the machete, sweat soaking my back. That night was worse than all the others. The sound came again, closer than ever, circling the camp. I heard branches snap, leaves crunch, heavy steps pacing. My breathing was shallow, and I tried not to move. Hours dragged on like that, the thing outside waiting, circling, testing. At one point, I thought I heard it touch the tent fabric, the faintest brush of pressure. My whole body stiffened until I thought I would break. When morning finally came, I unzipped the tent slowly, afraid of what I would see. The ground was covered in fresh tracks. They were huge, clear, pressed deep into the mud. I didn't measure, but each one looked nearly the size of my chest. I didn't need to know what animal it was. I just knew I had to leave. I didn't stop moving that day. I pushed through brush until my legs gave out, then forced them forward again. My hands were cut from vines, my skin raw from sweat and bites, but I didn't care. The sound followed for hours, closer at times, then farther, but always there. By late afternoon, I finally saw a sign of people. A plastic bottle caught in the mud, then a faint trail, then the riverbank where I had first been dropped off. I stumbled out of the trees, my body shaking, my mouth dry. I dropped my pack and sat on the ground, staring at the water. For the first time in days, the sound was gone. Whatever it was had stayed in the trees, letting me go. I don't know if it was a jaguar, a tapir, or something else. I'll never know. What I do know is that the jungle had watched me the entire time, waiting. It had reminded me in every step, every breath, that I didn't belong there. I never went back. I still remember the hunting trip I took in the fall of 2006. I was 24 at the time, and I had saved up some money to take a trip out to the northern woods of Wisconsin. It wasn't my first time hunting, but it was the first time I had gone completely alone. I wanted a weekend of quiet, just me, my rifle, and the woods. The drive up from Milwaukee took nearly 6 hours. By the time I reached the trail that led into the forest, the sun was dipping low, spilling an orange glow over the tops of the trees. The air smelled like pine and cold earth. I parked my old Ford on a gravel pull-off, slung my backpack and rifle over my shoulders, and started walking down the trail. The plan was simple. Hike in about 3 miles, set up camp, hunt during the day, and return by Sunday afternoon. The ground was damp, the soil soft from rain the night before. Fallen leaves stuck to my boots as I trudged deeper into the trees. After about an hour, I found a small clearing near a stream, enough flat space to pitch my tent. I set down my pack, built a fire pit out of rocks, and worked quickly as the light drained away. By the time I had the tent up and a small fire going, the woods had gone dark except for the flames. The night was quiet, except for the distant rush of water and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. I cooked a can of chili over the fire, ate in silence, and lay back against my rolled-up jacket. The stars were sharp through the branches, and for a while, I felt calm. The cold crept in around midnight, and I finally crawled into my sleeping bag. I woke at dawn to the sound of birds and the crisp smell of morning frost. The fire had gone cold, so I broke it apart, ate a quick breakfast of granola, and headed out with my rifle. The woods were thick, tall pines mixed with bare oaks. I moved slow, scanning the ground for tracks. After 2 hours, I spotted deer prints in the mud near the stream. I followed them deeper, stepping carefully to keep quiet. Around mid-morning, I saw movement through the trees, just the white flick of a tail. I raised my rifle, steadied my breath, and waited. The deer stepped into view, a decent-sized buck. I fired once, and the shot cracked through the forest. The deer stumbled, ran a short distance, then collapsed. I slung the rifle and walked over, my heart pounding from the adrenaline. It was a clean shot. I dressed the deer right there, the smell of blood sharp in the cool air. I knew I'd have to drag it back to camp and hang it up to keep it safe from scavengers. The work took longer than I thought, and by the time I got the deer tied to a tree near my camp, the afternoon was fading. That evening, I cooked a small portion of meat over the fire. The rest I planned to deal with in the morning. I sat close to the flames, warming my hands. The quiet felt heavier than the night before. Every little sound in the woods made me stop chewing and listen. At one point, I thought I heard twigs snapping on the far edge of the clearing, but when I shined my flashlight in that direction, all I saw was a line of black trunks and shadows. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just animals smelling the carcass. Still, I stoked the fire higher than usual and sat with my rifle resting against my leg. I didn't crawl into the tent until after midnight, when the fire had burned down to glowing coals. The sound woke me. It wasn't loud, but sharp enough to cut through my sleep. Something moving outside the tent, just a few feet away. My first thought was a bear. I sat frozen in my bag, holding my breath. Then I heard the slow crunch of footsteps circling. They were steady, deliberate, too controlled to be an animal. I reached for my rifle, careful not to make a sound. The footsteps stopped right at the front of my tent. My pulse hammered in my ears. Whoever or whatever was there didn't speak, didn't move. They just stood there. I stayed as still as I could, gripping the rifle, listening. After what felt like an hour but was probably just a minute, the sound of footsteps drifted away into the trees. I didn't sleep again. I sat up in the dark, staring at the fabric of the tent, my hands tight on the rifle. When dawn came, I crawled out slowly. The clearing looked empty, but something wasn't right. The deer carcass I had hung in the tree was gone. The rope still dangled, cut clean, not chewed through, cut with something sharp. That hit me hard. A bear would have torn it down, dragged it, left pieces. But this was clean, deliberate. Someone had walked into my camp in the middle of the night and taken it. My chest felt tight as I looked around the clearing. No tracks stood out clearly on the cold ground, but I knew what had happened. I decided then I wasn't staying another night. I packed fast, tearing down the tent, stuffing everything back into my bag. The fire pit was still black with ash when I slung the rifle and started back toward the trail. I moved quick, but every step felt watched. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of my own boots. About halfway back, I stopped to rest near a fallen log. That's when I noticed it. On the ground beside the trail, pressed into the mud, was a boot print. It wasn't mine. The tread was different, smaller, fresh, pointed in the same direction I was heading. Whoever had been in my camp wasn't just out there randomly. They were moving along the same trail I had come in on. I tightened my grip on the rifle and kept moving. My legs ached, but I didn't stop again until I saw the glint of my truck through the trees. Relief washed over me, but it didn't last. On the hood of the truck, scratched into the dirt of the paint, was a line. Just one deep line, dragged from one side to the other, like someone had taken a knife and carved across it. I threw my pack into the bed, climbed into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. The woods were still and silent, the trail behind me empty. I started the engine, the sound too loud, bouncing through the trees. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel. I didn't look back again. I drove straight through until I hit the highway, the woods fading in the rear view. I didn't stop until I was back home, the sun already gone. I parked in front of my apartment and sat there in the dark cab for a long time. To this day, I don't know who was out there. All I know is that someone followed me, cut down my deer, and walked through my camp in the middle of the night. I never went back to those woods again. Every time I think about it, I picture that clean-cut rope swinging in the dawn light and the boot print pointing the same way I was walking. That hunting trip taught me something I've never forgotten. The woods aren't always empty, and sometimes the scariest thing out there isn't the animals. It's the people you don't see. I was 26 years old in the summer of 2014 when I decided to take a short trip out to the countryside on my own. I had been working in the city for years and felt burned out. A friend of mine had distant relatives in Illinois who owned a large piece of farmland, and through him I got permission to camp there for a few days. It wasn't a commercial campground, just private property with old barns, empty fields, and rows of corn stretching as far as I could see. That was exactly what I wanted: quiet, open space, no neighbors close by. I drove out one hot Friday afternoon, the sun beating down on the hood of my old Ford, the air heavy and sticky with late July heat. By the time I reached the farm, the fields shimmered like they were made of glass. The place looked frozen in time. Leaning barns with rusted tin roofs, a windmill that creaked every time the breeze shifted, and long gravel paths overgrown with weeds. I parked near one of the barns, grabbed my pack, and walked about a quarter mile toward the back of the property where a wide clearing sat between the cornfields and a small pond. That's where I set up my tent. By dusk, the cicadas had taken over the soundscape. Their sharp, buzzing rhythm filled every inch of the air. I cooked a small meal on my portable stove, just canned beans and bread, and sat watching the sun sink behind the corn. Everything smelled of dirt, dry stalks, and pond algae. It felt different from the city. Every movement carried, every rustle seemed louder. By the time I crawled into my tent, the sky was a bowl of stars and the air had cooled. I thought I'd sleep easy, but I didn't. Somewhere deep into the night, I woke up with my skin prickling. First, I thought it was just the chill. Then I realized what had woken me. The sound of steps in the dirt, heavy and uneven, coming from somewhere near the barn I had passed earlier. I told myself it was probably a cow or maybe a deer straying close. But the steps didn't sound like hooves. They sounded like boots dragging a little between each crunch of gravel. I lay still inside my sleeping bag, listening. The steps paused, then started again, slower now, as if whoever it was had stopped to look around. The barn was far enough from my tent that I couldn't see it in the dark, but close enough that every sound carried cleanly. My heart beat harder than I wanted to admit. I stayed quiet, waiting for the steps to fade. After several long minutes, they did. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. Maybe it had been a farmhand checking on equipment, though I hadn't been told anyone lived or worked on the property full-time. Still, daylight makes everything less threatening. I brewed instant coffee, took a walk around the pond, and even went exploring near the barn. The doors were chained, the wood splintered and gray. No fresh tracks in the dirt, nothing out of place. By afternoon, the heat was brutal. I spent most of the day reading in the shade, then cooked a simple meal again. When darkness fell, I felt tense but tried to ignore it. I zipped up the tent, laid down, and forced myself to sleep. It didn't last long. Around midnight, I woke again. This time it wasn't just steps. It was the distinct sound of something brushing through the corn. The stalks made a dry, rattling sound as they bent and snapped back. It moved slow, like someone weaving carefully, not an animal running. I held my breath, straining to tell the direction. It circled, always staying within the rows but never entering the clearing. The sound went on for what felt like half an hour. Eventually it stopped, but the silence that followed felt even worse, like the air was waiting. I didn't sleep after that. At the first hint of dawn, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The clearing looked normal, but I noticed faint impressions near the edge of the corn, not deep enough to be boot prints, but too organized to be random. It looked like someone had been standing there for a long time, shifting their weight. The second day dragged on heavy with dread. I kept telling myself to pack up and leave, but pride or stubbornness kept me there. I told myself one more night, then I'd head back early in the morning. That evening I built a small fire, even though I hadn't planned on it. The flames gave me comfort. I sat close, staring at the orange glow, pretending it was just another camping trip. When I finally went to bed, I kept a flashlight and my pocket knife within reach. The noises came earlier this time. Not even 2 hours after lying down, I heard the crunch of gravel again. This time closer, moving along the path toward the pond. I froze, my hand tight around the flashlight. The steps slowed as they neared the clearing. I could hear the shift of weight, the scuff of something dragging. Then silence. I waited, barely breathing. Suddenly, the zipper of my tent rattled. I bolted upright, snapping the flashlight on, but the beam only lit the fabric from the inside. Whoever or whatever had touched it had already stepped back. I could hear retreating steps, faster now, fading toward the barn. My throat went dry. I stayed awake until morning, shaking. At sunrise, I made my decision. I packed everything fast, shoving gear into the bag without caring if it fit right. As I loaded the car, I scanned the property, half expecting to see someone watching from the corn or the barn. Nothing moved, but when I opened the driver's side door, I saw it. Muddy fingerprints smeared on the handle. Long, clear streaks, left there overnight while I slept. That was enough. I drove away without looking back, the gravel spitting under my tires. My heart only slowed once I hit the highway and the fields gave way to gas stations and traffic. I never reported it. I don't even know what I would have said. Trespassing? Some drifter wandering the farm? Maybe. All I know is that someone was out there those nights, circling the tent, standing in the corn, trying the zipper. It's been years since then, but even now I can't sleep in total silence. I need the sound of traffic, of neighbors, of people near. Whenever I think about that farm, the image that comes back isn't the cornfields or the pond or the barn. It's the shape of those fingerprints on the car handle. Proof that I hadn't imagined a thing. I had been traveling through Europe during the summer of 2016. I was 26 at the time, restless, and carrying a backpack that I thought made me look more adventurous than I actually was. I wanted to save money, so I decided to camp whenever I could instead of paying for hostels. Most of the time it was fine. Quiet spots on the edge of small towns, campgrounds near rivers, or tucked away in fields where no one bothered me. One particular night, I ended up in the south of France, not far from the Dordogne Valley. The sun had been hot all day, and by evening I was exhausted from walking. I followed a small dirt path off the main road, past a stretch of farmland, until I found a clearing lined with trees. It seemed quiet enough. I could hear crickets in the grass, and the faint sound of water trickling somewhere close. I pitched my small tent under an oak tree, laid out my sleeping bag, and boiled some instant noodles on a little camping stove. By the time the sky turned dark, I was already lying inside the tent, sweating a little from the warmth still lingering in the ground. I scrolled through old photos on my phone until the battery died, then put it aside. The silence felt heavy, broken only by the occasional croak of frogs or the sound of wind moving through leaves. It must have been close to midnight when I heard the first noise. At first it was faint, like footsteps dragging through grass. I froze, listening. I thought it might have been an animal, maybe a fox or even a wild boar, since the area was rural. I held still, waiting. The sound paused, then continued, slow and steady. Definitely footsteps, not the fast scurry of an animal. I pulled myself up and pressed my ear against the thin fabric of the tent. My heart thudded against my chest. Whoever it was, they weren't moving fast. It was almost like they were circling, their shoes brushing against the dry ground every few seconds. I tried to tell myself it could just be another traveler or a farmer checking his land. Still, the thought of unzipping the tent and finding someone standing there made my skin crawl. The footsteps stopped. For a few minutes, I heard nothing but my own breathing. Then suddenly, there was a sharp crack of a branch snapping. It sounded too close, only a few meters away. I sat frozen in the dark, staring at the thin shape of the tent walls, half expecting a shadow to appear against them. Nothing did. I clenched my pocket knife in my hand, though I knew it was small and wouldn't help much. Minutes passed, and I convinced myself it was nothing. I lay back down, though my body stayed tense. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, that it was probably just a random hiker heading home late. Eventually, my eyelids grew heavy, and I drifted in and out of shallow sleep. Sometime later, maybe an hour, maybe less, I woke up again. This time, I didn't hear footsteps. Instead, I felt something different. The air inside the tent was warmer, heavier, as if someone had been standing too close. My ears picked up the faintest sound, like breathing, slow and steady, just outside the thin nylon wall. I didn't move. I lay stiff, trying to control my own breath, afraid to make noise. The sound of that breathing continued for what felt like forever, hovering at one spot. My skin prickled with sweat. Finally, after what could have been minutes or seconds, it stopped. Then came the sound of footsteps again, this time walking away, fading into the dark. I couldn't sleep after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the tent zipper being pulled open, a face leaning in. I waited for the first sign of dawn, when the sky finally began to pale. As soon as there was enough light to see, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The clearing was empty. The grass was wet with dew, and everything looked peaceful, almost too peaceful. I checked around the area, half expecting to find nothing. But near the edge of the clearing, not far from my tent, I noticed something in the dirt. Shoe prints. They were larger than mine, deeper, and clear enough that I knew it hadn't been my imagination. Someone had stood there, only feet from where I slept. I hurried to pack up my things, stuffing the tent and sleeping bag into my backpack with shaky hands. I wanted to get back to the road as fast as I could. As I was rolling up my mat, I noticed something else. On the tree nearest my tent, there was a mark, a long, thin scrape in the bark, as though someone had dragged a knife or sharp object down its surface. It wasn't old. The wood underneath looked fresh and pale. That chilled me more than the footsteps had. It meant whoever was out there had stood in the dark, right by me, and made that mark while I was inside the tent pretending to sleep. I couldn't stop picturing it. Someone running a blade slowly down the tree trunk while listening to me breathe only a few feet away. I shoved the last of my gear into my bag and got moving. The road wasn't far, but every sound made me jump. A crow flying out of a tree, a dog barking in the distance. Everything felt like it was following me. When I finally stepped onto the main road and saw a car drive past, I felt a kind of relief I hadn't felt in years. I didn't camp alone for a while after that. Even now, thinking about it years later, the memory makes my stomach turn. There hadn't been a ghost, no strange legend, no fairy tale twist. It was just a man who found my tent in the woods and decided to stand outside it in the dark, breathing, marking the tree. I'll never know why he was there or what he wanted, but I do know that if I hadn't woken up when I did, or if I had unzipped that tent out of curiosity, things could have ended a lot differently. That was the last night I ever camped in a random clearing. From then on, I only stayed in proper campgrounds with other people around. I learned that the real danger isn't in the stories we tell about haunted forests. It's in the living people who decide to walk into them at night. I had always loved the outdoors, but the trip I took in the summer of 2011 still hangs in my mind like a scar. I was 28 at the time, living in Ohio, and I decided to take a week off work to drive south into Tennessee for a solo camping trip. I wanted quiet, a place far from people, somewhere to breathe. I packed my old Chevy with my tent, cooler, rifle, and a duffel of clothes. My plan was simple: camp out for 4 nights in a secluded state forest I'd read about, hunt a little, hike, and just clear my head. The forest was thick, with rolling hills, streams cutting through valleys, and long gravel roads that seemed endless. By the time I turned off the main highway, it felt like I had driven into another world. The road narrowed to dirt, and every mile deeper into the woods made the air feel heavier. It was mid-July, humid, the kind of heat that sticks to your skin. My shirt clung to my back before I had even pitched my tent. I found a clearing a good mile off the main road, not an official campsite, just a flat patch of ground near a small creek. No one would bother me there. I set up my tent, a simple 2-man canvas thing I'd had since college. I built a fire ring from rocks, stacked wood, and got my camp in order. I remember how quiet it was, the kind of quiet where every little snap of a twig makes your head turn. That first night was uneventful. I ate a can of chili, listened to crickets, and laid on my back staring at the stars. Out there, the sky looked endless, sharp with constellations I couldn't see from home. I felt good, like I'd made the right choice. But the second day started to change that. I went for a long hike, following the creek deeper into the woods. After maybe 2 hours, I noticed footprints in the mud. Not fresh, but not old either. Big boot prints headed in the same direction I was walking. They weren't mine. I paused longer than I probably should have, just staring at them. I told myself hunters or hikers must have been through here, but it unsettled me more than I admitted at the time. On the way back that evening, I heard movement in the trees behind me. Every time I stopped, the noise stopped. It wasn't a deer, too heavy. I turned around once, catching what I swore was a figure slipping behind a tree, but I convinced myself it was just my nerves. By the time I reached camp, the sweat on my back wasn't just from the heat. That night, I barely slept. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of water splashing at the creek. Something was moving down there. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and peeked out. The moonlight was bright enough to see the outline of someone crouched at the water, maybe 50 yards away. I froze, not even breathing. It wasn't an animal. It was a man. He wasn't doing anything but crouching there, running his hands through the water. I stayed still for a long time, watching him. Finally, he stood and walked back into the trees without ever looking in my direction. I didn't sleep at all after that. By morning, I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe he was just another camper or someone fishing. But what gnawed at me was how quiet he'd been. No flashlight, no gear, no sound of boots on rocks. Nothing. Just there, then gone. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I didn't. Pride, maybe, or stupidity. The third day dragged on, heavy with unease. Every sound in the woods felt sharper. Around noon, I noticed something wrong near my camp. My cooler had been moved. Not opened, not taken, just shifted about a foot like someone had nudged it with their boot. The hairs on my neck stood up. That night, I decided to keep the fire going longer than usual, hoping the light would deter whoever might be creeping around. I sat up with my rifle across my lap, listening, waiting. Around 2 in the morning, I heard slow, deliberate footsteps circling just beyond the firelight, crunching leaves, snapping twigs, always staying just far enough away that I couldn't see. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. Whoever it was never came closer, just circled and circled until finally it stopped. I sat there until dawn, hands shaking on the rifle, eyes burning from exhaustion. By then, leaving wasn't just an idea, it was survival. I packed everything in a rush, barely folding the tent, shoving gear into the Chevy. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just wanted to get out. But the forest didn't make it easy. The dirt road out seemed longer than when I came in, every bend making me think someone was waiting around the corner. I drove fast, too fast for those narrow tracks, but I couldn't slow down. My rearview mirror felt like it was pulling my eyes every other second. At one point, I swear I saw a man standing at the tree line as I rounded a curve, watching. When I finally hit the main highway, I pulled over at a gas station, shaking so bad I could barely hold the steering wheel. I sat there for half an hour, trying to calm down, trying to convince myself I was fine. I never reported it. What would I even say? Some guy walked near my tent and moved my cooler? No one would care. Maybe it was nothing. But deep down, I know it wasn't nothing. That man out there wasn't just passing through. He was watching me, studying me, waiting for something. Even now, years later, when I think about camping, I feel that same knot in my chest. I haven't gone alone since. I don't care how peaceful the woods look, how open the sky feels at night. There's nothing peaceful about being hunted by someone who doesn't want to be seen. And in that forest, I know for certain I was never alone. I still remember that trip like it happened yesterday. It was the summer of 2014, and I was 26 at the time. I had taken a week off work to do something different, something away from noise and routine. I packed up my old camping gear, loaded the back of my 2001 Jeep Cherokee, and drove out toward northern Michigan, far from towns and houses. I wanted quiet. I wanted to sit by a fire with only the sound of crickets and the woods around me. I had camped plenty of times before, but mostly at public campgrounds. This time, I wanted something more remote. I had looked over a map, found an old Forest Service road that cut into the state forest, and planned to set up a few miles in. The road was rough, filled with potholes and patches of mud, but the Jeep made it through fine. I pulled off onto a small clearing that looked like it hadn't been used in years. There were no picnic tables, no fire pits, just grass and uneven dirt. It was exactly what I wanted. By late afternoon, I had my tent pitched, my folding chair out, and a small fire burning. I cooked a simple meal, some sausages and bread I had wrapped in foil. After eating, I leaned back in my chair and just listened. The woods stretched out in all directions, thick with pine and oak. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles. I could hear nothing but birds and the occasional rustle of wind. For a while, I felt completely at peace. As the sun started dipping low, I noticed how quickly the forest darkened. The shadows stretched long and the tree line turned black against the orange sky. By the time the sun disappeared, the woods were completely different. The cheerful sound of birds gave way to the sharper cries of night insects and the occasional snap of branches somewhere deeper in the trees. I knew it was just raccoons or deer, but being alone out there, every sound made me more alert. I added more wood to the fire, making sure it burned strong. I didn't bring a gun, only a decent hunting knife and a small hatchet, but I figured that was enough. After a while, I crawled into my tent, zipped the flap, and laid down in my sleeping bag. The night was quiet except for the crackling fire outside and the wind moving through the trees. I drifted in and out of sleep, half listening to the sounds outside. It was close to midnight when I woke up again. First, I thought it was just the fire dying down that caught my attention. But then I heard something else. Footsteps. They weren't quick, they weren't loud, but they were steady, crunching on the dried leaves and sticks, moving around the clearing. My first thought was a deer, but the steps didn't sound like that. They were too deliberate, too slow, like someone was walking carefully. I held my breath inside the tent. My heart was hammering so hard it felt like it would shake the whole tent. The footsteps circled around for a while, and then everything went quiet again. I lay there frozen, clutching the knife inside my sleeping bag. My mind ran through every possibility. Maybe a lost hiker, maybe some hunter who didn't realize I was here, or maybe just my imagination making something out of nothing. Minutes felt like hours, but eventually I forced myself to unzip the tent a little and peek out. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, casting just enough light to see the clearing. Nothing moved. The woods were dark and still. I didn't see anyone. After a while, I convinced myself it must have been an animal and crawled back into my bag, though I couldn't get much sleep after that. At first light, I got up and stepped out of the tent. The air was cold and damp, with a layer of fog hugging the ground. I walked around the clearing just to check. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Human footprints, clear as day in the soft dirt near the edge of the clearing. They weren't mine. I hadn't walked there the day before. They circled the clearing once, close to the trees, then vanished back into the woods. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I tried to brush it off. Maybe some hiker had stumbled across my camp in the night, got spooked by the fire, and left. But the way the prints circled, it didn't look like someone passing through. It looked like someone watching. I kept busy that morning, cooking breakfast, gathering more firewood, anything to take my mind off it. By midday, I thought about packing up and leaving, but stubbornness kept me there. I had driven all the way out, and I told myself I wasn't going to let a set of footprints ruin it. That day passed without much happening. I fished in a nearby stream, walked a few trails, and tried to enjoy the quiet. But as evening crept in again, I couldn't shake the unease. I made sure to build a bigger fire this time, stacking enough wood to last through the night. I sat with my back against the Jeep, watching the tree line, listening for anything unusual. Around midnight again, the sounds started. Not just footsteps this time, but the distinct crack of branches under weight, the shuffle of something moving between the trees. I strained my eyes but couldn't see anything beyond the firelight. My hands were sweaty on the handle of the knife. The noises moved around me, circling again. Sometimes close, sometimes farther back, always just out of sight. Then came the smell. Cigarette smoke. Faint, but clear in the cold night air. My stomach dropped. No animal smelled like that. Someone was out there, close, watching me, smoking, moving slowly around my camp. I stayed awake the rest of that night, every muscle tense, staring at the dark. By morning, I was drained. I didn't even bother cooking breakfast. I started breaking down camp right away, stuffing gear back into the Jeep as fast as I could. I kept looking up, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the clearing. But the woods stayed empty. The drive back down the forest road felt endless. Every time the Jeep bounced in a rut or slowed in the mud, I imagined someone stepping out of the trees. But no one did. Eventually, I reached the main road and the small highway back toward town. Only then did I feel like I could breathe again. I never found out who was out there or why they circled my camp at night. I don't know if it was just some local messing with me or something worse. What I do know is that it wasn't an animal. I saw the footprints, I smelled the smoke, I heard the slow, deliberate steps. That was the last time I camped alone, far out in the woods. These days, if I go camping, it's at a public site with other people around. Some folks say being alone in the forest is peaceful, but once you've had someone you can't see circling your tent in the dark, you stop thinking of the woods as quiet and safe. For me, that night changed the way I look at camping forever. We drove up to the mountains late in the afternoon. The three of us crammed into my boss's old SUV. His name was Daniel. He was in his mid-40s, tall, and always carried himself like he was still in the office even when he wasn't. His wife, Laura, sat in the passenger seat, quiet most of the ride but smiling every so often, like she was trying to make the trip lighthearted. I was in the back, staring at the road and pretending not to feel awkward. I was 28 at the time, and this was my first time going on a camping trip with them. It wasn't exactly my idea, but when your boss invites you and says it'll be good for team bonding, you don't really say no. It was late September 2017, somewhere in the Sierra Nevada range of California. The leaves were already turning orange, and the air felt thinner the higher we climbed. By the time we turned off the main road and followed the dirt path toward a clearing, the sun had started dipping behind the trees. We found a small spot to camp near a creek. The water ran shallow but constant, making that soft sound of movement over rocks. There was no one else around, at least none that I saw. It felt isolated, and I remember noticing how fast the silence dropped once the SUV engine turned off. Out there, you could hear twigs snap from 50 feet away. We unpacked, set up the tents, got a fire going, and for a while everything felt fine. The smell of smoke mixed with pine needles. We roasted a bit of food, and Daniel poured himself a drink from a silver flask he brought along. He offered it to me, but I waved it off. I wanted to keep my head clear. Laura had a few sips though, and the way Daniel laughed when she did made me realize he was already a little drunk. As night fell, the temperature dropped fast. I remember the kind of cold that crawls under your jacket, the one that doesn't just brush your skin but hangs there, heavy. We sat around the fire, the flames throwing shadows against the tree trunks. I tried to stay focused on the crackling fire, but in the dark beyond it I kept catching movements. Small ones, faint, like something shifting between the trees. Every time I looked, there was nothing, just branches, the wind, shadows. I thought I was being paranoid, maybe because I wasn't used to being this far from people. But when Daniel got up to grab more wood, I noticed Laura's eyes darting into the dark the same way mine had. She quickly looked away when I caught her. Later, after we crawled into the tents, I couldn't sleep. The ground was hard, the cold biting through the sleeping bag. Every small sound outside pressed against my ears. I could hear the creak, the faint rustle of wind through branches. But there were other sounds too. A crunch of leaves, a step that seemed too heavy to be a raccoon. Then silence again. I stayed frozen, staring at the thin tent fabric above me, lit faintly by the moon. Hours dragged, or maybe just minutes, it was hard to tell. At some point I heard movement again, slower this time, circling. I was sure of it. Footsteps around the campsite, measured, deliberate. I didn't move, barely breathed, and waited. The zipper of the other tent, Daniel and Laura's, suddenly rattled softly. Not unzipped all the way, but tugged, tested. Then nothing. The hairs on my neck stood up. I couldn't take it anymore. I forced myself to sit up and unzip my tent just a few inches. Cold air rushed in and I peeked out. The fire had burned down to embers, giving off only a faint glow. The SUV sat where we left it. The trees swayed a little in the wind, but just beyond the firelight, maybe 20 yards out, I saw it. A figure, a man, standing still between two pines, his face hidden by shadow. He wasn't moving, just watching. I froze, gripping the zipper so tight my knuckles went white. I thought about calling out, but my throat locked up. The man didn't flinch, didn't shift, just stood there, half hidden by the dark. Then, slowly, he stepped backward until he disappeared into the trees. I stayed awake the rest of the night, too scared to close my eyes. Every time I blinked too long, I thought I'd open them and find that face inches from my tent. When morning finally came, I felt dizzy, exhausted. The sunlight felt almost fake, too bright after that night. Daniel looked rough too, but he brushed it off as a hangover. Laura didn't say much, and I knew she'd heard or seen something too, even if she pretended otherwise. I told myself maybe it was just a hiker, someone who wandered too close, though deep down I knew hikers don't just stand and watch like that. We tried to go about the day normally, but I couldn't shake it. I kept scanning the treeline, expecting him to appear again. We went for a short hike, and when we came back to camp, things were off. Laura's bag had been dragged a few feet from where she left it. The zipper was half open, and some clothes were scattered in the dirt. Daniel said maybe an animal got into it, but I knew animals don't unzip bags. They tear. They rip. This was careful. The rest of that day dragged like a weight. I could see Daniel trying to act like nothing was wrong, like he didn't want to admit anything. But Laura kept her eyes low, and I kept mine on the trees. That night was worse, much worse. The fire crackled low, and we all sat close without saying a word. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy, tense. Every sound in the woods made us jump. When we finally crawled back into the tents, I didn't even bother trying to sleep. I just lay there waiting. Sure enough, the sounds came back. Footsteps again, slow circling, then a scrape against the SUV, metal on metal. I held my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps came closer, right up to the tents. I could hear the crunch of dirt inches from where my head lay. Then a shadow fell across the thin fabric, blocking the faint moonlight. Someone stood right there, towering over my tent. I gripped a flashlight, my hand shaking so bad I almost dropped it. The shadow didn't move. It lingered. Finally, it shifted, heading toward Daniel and Laura's tent. I heard the soft press of a hand against their tent wall, sliding slowly along the fabric. Laura gasped faintly inside, and that sound must have startled him because suddenly the steps retreated, faster this time, back into the trees. I lay there frozen until the sky started to pale. At first light, I crawled out and looked around. Nothing seemed touched, but when I walked toward the edge of the trees, I saw them. Footprints in the dirt, heavy boots. They circled our campsite again and again, pressing deep into the ground. I didn't say a word, just pointed them out to Daniel and Laura. For the first time, I saw fear break through his face. He didn't argue, didn't brush it off. We packed up as fast as we could, tossing things into the SUV, barely caring what went where. The drive back down felt endless. I kept glancing behind us, half expecting to see another car following. We never talked about it afterward, not at work, not anywhere. Daniel went back to being the same boss, Laura went back to being polite when I saw her, and I went back to pretending it never happened. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. Someone was out there, watching us, waiting. And if Laura hadn't gasped that night, if we'd stayed another day, I don't think we'd have driven back down that mountain at all. I still remember that trip like it happened yesterday, even though it's been years. It was the summer of 2006, and I had just turned 23. I had saved up some money from working at a warehouse and bought myself a used tent, a cheap sleeping bag, and a secondhand backpack. I had always wanted to try camping alone, far away from the city noise. Most people I knew thought it was boring or dangerous, but I felt like I needed a break from everything, even if it was just for a few nights. I chose a spot in northern Michigan, near the Huron National Forest. It wasn't the kind of place packed with families and RVs, just scattered clearings and trails that hunters and fishermen sometimes used. I wanted quiet, and I got it. I parked my old car on the side of a dirt road, shouldered my pack, and walked about 2 miles until I found a flat spot near a slow-moving creek. It looked perfect. There was soft ground, some tall trees for shade, and enough open space to see around me in every direction. The first day went by peacefully. I set up my tent, gathered wood, and cooked some beans and hot dogs over a small fire. I walked along the creek, listening to the water move over rocks, and for the first time in months, I felt calm. When night came, I sat by the fire until the air turned cold. I crawled into my sleeping bag and listened to crickets and owls until I fell asleep. Nothing strange happened that night. It was exactly what I wanted. The second day was just as quiet. I spent hours walking around, exploring the woods and sitting by the creek. I didn't see anyone, not a single hiker or fisherman, which I thought was strange, but I didn't mind. I cooked another simple meal that evening and watched the sky turn dark purple as the sun went down. That night, though, I didn't fall asleep as easily. I kept hearing noises that didn't fit the rhythm of the forest. Twigs snapping, the sound of brush being pushed aside. It wasn't animals. I knew the difference between a raccoon scurrying and something heavier. Every time I sat up to listen, the sound stopped. I told myself it was my imagination, that being alone was making me paranoid. Eventually, I fell asleep. On the third morning, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. About 20 feet from my tent, near the edge of the creek, there were footprints in the mud. They weren't mine. They were from boots, not hiking boots, but more like work boots, wide and heavy. The prints led out of the water and into the trees behind my camp. I tried to tell myself someone must have been fishing early in the morning, but I had been awake just after dawn, and I didn't hear anyone. The more I looked at them, the more uneasy I felt. Whoever made them had come very close to my camp, close enough to see my tent, my fire pit, everything. I decided not to stay another night in that exact spot. I packed my things, though I took my time, trying not to panic. I told myself it would be smarter to move a mile or so downstream, just enough to feel like I wasn't in the same place someone had walked through. By afternoon, I found another clearing and set everything up again. But the feeling of peace I'd had when I first arrived was gone. That evening, I kept my fire smaller, barely enough to cook some noodles. I didn't want the light to draw attention. I sat in the dark longer than I wanted to, staring at the trees and listening for anything out of place. Around midnight, I finally got into the tent. I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember was waking to the sound of footsteps outside. They weren't hurried or loud, but slow, deliberate. The kind of steps someone makes when they don't want to be heard. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The footsteps circled the tent. I could hear them press into the dirt and leaves, each step heavier than the last. Then they stopped, just a few feet from where my head was. I lay there, heart pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. Minutes passed, or maybe just seconds, I couldn't tell. Finally, the sound of footsteps faded into the woods. I didn't move until the first light of dawn pushed through the fabric of my tent. When I got out, I didn't see anyone, but I saw what they had left behind. About 10 feet from the tent, stuck into the ground, was a broken branch. It was sharpened at one end, like someone had whittled it down into a point. It wasn't there the day before. I knew then I had to leave. I packed everything as fast as I could, my hands shaking. The walk back to my car felt like the longest 2 miles of my life. Every sound made me turn my head, expecting someone to step out from behind a tree. When I finally saw my car, sitting alone on that dirt road, I felt relief for the first time. But the story didn't end there. When I got closer, I noticed something on my car that hadn't been there before. On the driver's side window, drawn with what looked like the tip of a dirty finger, was a long, smeared line. Not words, not a picture, just one long streak down the glass. Like someone had been standing there, waiting, and wanted me to know they had touched my car. I didn't waste a second. I threw my backpack into the seat, started the engine, and drove until I hit the main highway. I didn't stop until I was back in town, parked in front of my small apartment. For days after, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying it in my head, wondering if it had been one person or more, wondering how long they had been watching me. I thought about those footprints, the sharpened stick, the finger mark on my window. None of it was random. Someone had been trying to scare me, maybe worse. That trip taught me something I'll never forget. The woods aren't dangerous because of animals or getting lost. They're dangerous because you never know who else is out there. Not everyone goes to the forest to camp or fish. Some people go out there because it's the perfect place to do whatever they want, away from anyone who could help you. I never went camping alone again. I was 34 when I decided to take a short trip out into the woods of northern Michigan. It was the summer of 2011, and after years of working as a police officer in Detroit, I felt like I needed a stretch of quiet. The city had drained me with its constant noise, sirens at night, fights in the streets, and the heavy weight of every call I answered. I wasn't a man who went camping often, but something about the thought of sitting under the trees, far away from flashing lights and paperwork, made me believe it might help. I packed my truck with a tent, some food, water, and my old service pistol. Carrying the gun had become second nature to me, and even on a trip meant for peace, I wasn't going to leave it behind. I drove out past Traverse City and into a state forest that most people skipped over because it wasn't marked with campgrounds or hiking trails. I wanted to be alone, not surrounded by RVs and kids with bikes. By the time I found a spot that felt right, the sun was already lowering, and the orange light cut through the trees like a warm haze. I parked the truck off a dirt path, carried my gear deeper in, and set up my tent near a clearing. It wasn't perfect, but I could see the sky through the break in the trees and hear a small creek running somewhere behind the brush. The first night went by quietly. I sat by the small fire I built, eating a sandwich and listening to the forest come alive with crickets and the rustle of small animals. It wasn't until I lay down inside the tent that I noticed something that didn't sit right with me. The woods were dark, but darker than I expected. There was no glow of distant cabins or headlights, just a heavy blackness pressing in against the nylon walls. I could hear water running, and then a snap of branches somewhere out in the trees. I told myself it was just deer, rolled over, and tried to sleep. The second day I hiked around, followed the creek, and spent some time sitting on a fallen log with my notebook. I didn't write much, just random words, thoughts about work, little things about cases I couldn't shake from my mind. That habit never really left me. As a cop, I carried the faces of people I couldn't help, and sometimes writing them down made me feel like I'd at least remembered them in some way. When evening came, I started a fire again, roasted some canned food, and tried to relax. It was when the fire burned down to embers that I caught something strange. Through the gap of trees, maybe 30 yards away, I saw movement. At first, I thought it was a shadow, but then I noticed the shape of a person standing very still. It was tall, broad-shouldered, and just outside the glow of the fire. I froze where I sat, my mind instantly sharp. The training kicked in. My right hand went down to my hip, resting against the pistol on my belt. I didn't pull it, but I felt the cold edge of the handle and kept my eyes locked on the figure. It didn't move for what felt like a full minute. Then, as if it realized I was staring, it stepped back into the dark and vanished among the trees. I didn't chase it. I didn't even call out. I just sat there with my pulse hammering in my ears until the fire gave off nothing but faint heat. By the time I crawled into my tent, I knew I wasn't going to sleep much. Morning came with heavy clouds and a damp smell in the air. I got up early and walked out to the spot where I had seen the figure. The ground was soft, covered in pine needles, but I found something that made my stomach drop. A shoe print, not a boot, not a hiker's tread, but a worn-down running shoe, the kind city kids wore every day. It was too fresh to ignore. Somebody had been standing there, watching me. I kept telling myself maybe it was just another camper, but the problem was I had gone deep off the usual paths. There weren't campsites here. This wasn't the kind of forest people stumbled into unless they wanted to be far from others. And that was the part that didn't sit right with me. By evening, I was tense. I stacked the firewood closer to my tent and kept my pistol on my lap while I sat by the fire. The forest was quiet, too quiet compared to the night before. Around midnight, I heard it again. Branches breaking, footsteps that were too heavy to be deer. I turned my head slowly, and there he was again. A man, closer this time, maybe 20 yards away. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood in the shadows watching me. My chest tightened, and my instincts screamed at me to act. I raised the pistol, not pointing it, but enough that he could see the silver edge catch the firelight. For a second, I thought he would rush me, but then he turned and disappeared into the trees again. Silent this time. I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire with the gun in my hand, staring into the woods until the first gray light bled through the sky. My head pounded from exhaustion, but I knew one thing: this trip was over. I had no idea who that man was or why he was out here, but I wasn't about to stick around and find out. When I packed my gear, I noticed something that stopped me cold. On the side of my tent, scratched into the fabric, were 3 long marks. They weren't from an animal. They were deliberate, carved by a knife or some sharp edge. The cuts weren't deep, but they were enough to let me know that while I sat awake all night watching the trees, he had been close enough to touch my tent without me hearing. I left everything I couldn't carry, slung my bag over my shoulder, and made for the truck. Every step I took felt like someone was walking behind me. I didn't run, but I kept my hand on the pistol the whole way. When I finally saw the truck through the trees, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I threw my gear in the back, slammed the door, and started the engine. The dirt path out of there felt longer than it had going in, every bump and turn stretching my nerves thinner. As I pulled onto the main road, I checked the rearview mirror. For a second, I thought I saw movement, a figure standing on the tree line watching the road. It was too quick to be sure, and I didn't slow down to look again. I drove straight back to the city without stopping. The whole ride, my chest felt tight, and my hands stayed clenched on the wheel. It wasn't fear of some ghost or monster. It was the knowledge of how real people could be when they wanted to do harm. I'd spent years as a cop, seen what humans were capable of in alleys, in houses, in the middle of the street. But sitting alone in those woods, I realized something heavier. Out there, away from the noise and the backup, away from any quick call for help, I was just a man. That was the last time I ever went camping alone. I was 27 in the summer of 2014 when I decided to take a solo camping trip through the upper part of Montana. I had been working long weeks at a warehouse job in Spokane, Washington, and I felt like I was losing my mind between fluorescent lights, the sound of forklifts beeping, and the endless repetition of moving boxes. I didn't have much money, but I had my old Ford pickup, a tent I bought secondhand at a thrift store, and enough supplies to last a few days. I picked a spot near Flathead National Forest, a place I had only read about online. From the pictures, it looked quiet and untouched. The kind of place you could just disappear into for a few days, breathe clean air, and reset. I didn't tell many people where I was going. Just a vague, headed out camping for a few days. Looking back, that might have been my first mistake. The drive itself took nearly 6 hours, with the last hour crawling along dirt roads where my tires kicked up dust that clung to the hot air. The deeper I went, the more silence pressed in around me. Even my truck engine seemed too loud. When I finally pulled into a clearing by a small river, the sun was low but still throwing golden light across the trees. The place looked perfect. No other vehicles, no trash, just an old stone fire pit someone had used long before me. I set up my tent, stacked some firewood, and cooked a small meal on my camp stove. For a while, everything was exactly how I pictured it. The sound of running water, the smell of pine, the feeling that I had carved out a little corner of the world for myself. It wasn't until the second night that something felt wrong. The day had been long and quiet. I hiked a little, fished a little, and read from a book I had brought along. By the time the sun slipped behind the hills, I had a fire going and was boiling water for coffee. That's when I noticed something that made me freeze. On the opposite bank of the river, half hidden in the trees, was what looked like a figure standing still. At first, I told myself it was just a tree trunk. My eyes were playing tricks on me in the low light. But the longer I stared, the more I realized the shape wasn't right for a tree. Too narrow at the bottom, too broad at the top. The fire crackled, my water bubbled, but I just sat there watching until my eyes watered. And then, as if it knew I was staring, the shape moved back into the darkness. I stayed awake longer than I wanted that night, ears sharp for every branch snap and rustle of leaves. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me into a light, restless sleep. I dreamed of nothing, just endless black. The next morning, I found footprints. They were across the river, leading down the bank into the mud. Human, barefoot, bigger than mine. I crouched there staring at them, the damp soil still holding their shape as if they had been pressed in only hours ago. I tried to brush it off. Maybe someone else was camping upriver, walking around at night, curious about my fire. It wasn't illegal, wasn't impossible. Still, the thought of someone watching me without saying a word settled heavy in my chest. I kept busy that day. I gathered extra firewood, double-checked my gear, and kept my folding knife clipped to my belt even when I was just sitting. The forest didn't feel the same anymore. The birds still sang, but between their calls was a quiet that seemed thicker, heavier, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. That night it rained, soft at first and then harder, drumming on the nylon of my tent. My fire hissed and died out, and I sat inside my tent listening to the waterfall. Sometime after midnight, through the steady patter of rain, I heard it, footsteps in the mud outside. Slow, deliberate. I held my breath, clutching the knife in my sleeping bag. The steps circled my tent, not close enough to touch the walls, but close enough that I could hear the squelch of mud with each shift of weight. Then, nothing, just rain. I don't know how long I stayed awake like that, muscles locked, eyes wide in the dark. I must have drifted off near dawn because I woke to the thin gray light of morning and a soaked campsite. I checked around, but the rain had washed away everything. No footprints this time. I wanted to pack up and leave right then, but something in me resisted. Pride, maybe, or stubbornness. I told myself I wasn't going to get chased off by shadows and sounds, so I stayed one more night. That choice still sits in my stomach like a stone. The evening was cold and damp, the fire smoke clinging to me as I sat close for warmth. Every sound beyond the firelight set my nerves on edge. A snapping branch had me turning my head. The distant cry of something, maybe a fox, maybe something else, made my skin crawl. When I finally turned in, I left my knife beside me and kept the lantern burning low. The night stretched on, hour after hour of shifting in my sleeping bag, ears straining for noise. And then I heard it again. Not footsteps this time. Breathing. Slow, heavy breathing, just outside the thin nylon wall of my tent. I went rigid. The sound was inches away from me, steady and deep, like someone standing there in the dark, watching. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I thought if I stayed silent, maybe they'd go away. After what felt like forever, the breathing stopped. I lay there until the lantern burned out on its own, every muscle aching from tension. When the first light of morning came, I packed up everything as fast as I could. My hands shook as I shoved the tent poles into their bag, the whole time feeling like I was being watched from the trees. I didn't eat, didn't even make coffee. I just threw everything into the truck and drove, bouncing hard over the ruts in the dirt road. I didn't stop until I hit a gas station miles away. Only then did I let myself breathe properly. My clothes smelled like smoke and damp earth. My eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, and I couldn't stop glancing at the tree line beyond the pumps. I never went back to that spot. I never even looked up camping areas in Montana again. To this day, I don't know who or what kind of person was out there those nights. Maybe someone living off the grid, maybe someone with worse intentions. All I know is that I was being watched. Not just by chance, not just in passing. Someone knew I was there and chose not to show themselves. They circled my tent, breathed outside my walls, and never said a word. That silence is what sticks with me most. Not a greeting, not a warning. Just the slow, patient sound of someone standing in the rain, inches away, while I lay frozen inside a thin sheet of nylon. It was a reminder that out in the woods, away from everything, you're not protected by anything but your own choices. And I had chosen wrong by staying. I left that forest, but part of me still feels like it never let go of me. I was 21 in the summer of 2014 when a group of us decided to go camping in northern Michigan. There were 6 of us total, me, my 2 closest friends Daniel and Ryan, and 3 girls we'd known since high school, Jenna, Emily, and Laura. We had just finished our last year of college and wanted one final trip before jobs and real life started to weigh us down. We drove up in 2 cars packed with coolers, tents, and old sleeping bags, heading toward the edge of a forest that stretched around Lake Manistee. None of us had ever been up that far, but the area was supposed to be quiet, almost empty of tourists. That was the draw, no crowds, no campgrounds, just wilderness. We found a dirt road that ran off the highway, bouncing over potholes for almost half an hour until it ended in a clearing. From there, we hauled our stuff down a narrow trail that pushed through thick pines, finally opening to a stretch of ground not far from the lake. The air smelled sharp with pine sap and the water shimmered pale blue in the late afternoon sun. We set up 2 tents side by side, one for the guys and one for the girls, right at the edge of the tree line. The girls spread out a blanket and unpacked snacks while we tried to get a fire pit going with rocks we gathered. By the time we had a fire built and food cooking, the sun was dipping low. We ate, laughed, and passed beers around until the first stars started to show. The forest hummed with crickets and the occasional splash from the lake when fish broke the surface. Felt perfect then. The 6 of us circled around the fire, the glow flickering across faces I had known for years, the kind of moment you think back to later and wish you could freeze. None of us noticed how dark the woods behind us had become or how far the firelight actually reached. Sometime after midnight, when the fire burned down to orange coals, we finally went into our tents. The guys' tents smelled like damp nylon and old sweat from the sleeping bags. I lay on my back listening to Daniel snoring almost instantly and Ryan shifting in his bag. For a long time, I stared at the nylon roof just inches above my face, feeling the stillness of the forest pressing in. When I finally drifted off, it wasn't deep sleep, more like that light, half-awake state where every sound pulls you back to the surface. A noise woke me maybe an hour later. It was faint but sharp enough to cut through the layers of sleep. First, I thought it was one of the girls laughing quietly, but it didn't sound like a voice. It was a snap, the distinct crack of a stick breaking under weight. I held my breath and waited. The forest was still again except for the low wash of crickets. Then another snap, closer this time. I nudged Ryan, but he was out cold. Daniel groaned and rolled over. I stayed quiet, straining to hear. The steps weren't fast or heavy, just slow, deliberate movements in the leaves and twigs just outside our tent. My skin crawled in the dark. We had food out. Maybe it was a raccoon or a deer passing through, but the sound wasn't random. It was steady, like someone pacing just out of sight. The sound stopped for a long moment. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Then came the soft scrape of something brushing against the fabric wall of the tent. inches from where my head rested. I froze, every muscle in my body tight, eyes wide though I couldn't see a thing in the dark. The brush moved slowly, like a hand dragging along the nylon. Then silence again. I don't know how long I lay there, minutes, maybe an hour, staring into the dark with dry eyes, waiting for the next sound. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me back under. When I woke again, morning light filtered through the tent walls, and the air was cool and damp with dew. Daniel was already outside, stretching. Ryan was still asleep. When I stepped out, nothing looked disturbed. The fire pit was cold ashes, the coolers closed. But on the dirt near the girls' tent, there were faint boot prints. Not ours. These were larger, the sole pattern different from the sneakers we all wore. They led out from the tree line and stopped near the tents, circling a little before fading back into the woods. I said nothing at first, telling myself they might have been hours from setting up. Still, I kept staring until my stomach turned. The girls came out yawning and pulling hoodies on, complaining about the hard ground. I watched their faces as they moved around, wondering if they had heard anything in the night. Nobody said a word, so I kept quiet too. We spent the day hiking along the lake, swimming, and eating sandwiches on fallen logs. It should have been easy, but I couldn't stop checking the tree line. That night, after more food and fire, after more beers and laughing, I couldn't shake the unease. Everyone eventually collapsed back into the tents. I lay awake again, waiting, and again the noises came. It started with a faint crunch of leaves, then a pause, then another step. It was closer than before, circling slowly. My chest tightened as I realized it wasn't just near our tent. It moved toward the girls' tent too. The sound of fabric shifting came again, a faint drag against nylon. My throat felt dry as sandpaper. This time, I forced myself to look. I unzipped the tent just a few inches and peeked out. The moon gave a dim silver glow to the clearing. For a second, I saw nothing but the fire pit and the lake in the distance. Then movement. At the edge of the trees, maybe 30 feet away, stood a figure. A man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing some kind of dark jacket. His face was shadowed, but his head was turned toward the tents, completely still. He didn't move, didn't step closer, just stood there watching. I let the flap fall back down and lay frozen, heart hammering so hard I thought it would wake the others. I didn't sleep at all that night, listening until dawn broke through the trees. When I finally stepped outside, the spot where he had stood looked empty, the ground bare except for flattened grass. That morning, I told the others we needed to leave. I didn't care how it sounded. Maybe it was the prints, maybe it was the exhaustion etched into my face, but nobody argued. We packed in a rush, stuffing sleeping bags half folded and scattering ashes from the fire pit. As we hauled our gear back up the trail toward the cars, I felt the weight of eyes on my back. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him again, but the trees stayed still. We loaded everything fast and pulled back onto the road. None of us spoke much on the drive. Back in town, at a gas station, I finally saw it clear. On the notice board near the door was a faded flyer. A man's face, grainy and stern, stared out under bold letters. Missing since 2012. Last seen in the Manistee National Forest area. Asterisk asterisk, the photo looked older, but the shape of the face, the build, the heavy brow, it was too close to what I had seen standing at the tree line. We never went back after that. I still camp sometimes, but never that deep, never that far from other people. And every time I zip a tent closed at night, I remember the sound of those slow, steady steps circling in the dark, and the figure standing silent in the trees. I was 22 when I went on a solo camping trip in the south of France in the summer of 2014. I had been traveling through Europe with a small backpack, And by the time I reached France, I was tired of hostels, cities, and the noise of trains. I wanted quiet, I wanted open space, and I wanted to feel alone for a little while. I bought a cheap one-person tent in a small outdoor shop in Toulouse and caught a bus that dropped me off near the edge of a forest outside a small village called St. Girons. The locals didn't pay me much attention. It was one of those towns that felt like nothing had changed in 50 years. Old stone houses, shutters closed in the afternoon heat, dogs asleep in the shade of narrow streets. I filled my water bottles at a fountain and started walking into the hills. The forest swallowed the road quickly. The air smelled of pine and dry earth, and the cicadas screeched non-stop in the heat. My plan was simple. Hike up until I found a flat patch away from trails, pitch the tent, spend the night, then head back down the next morning. It wasn't dangerous terrain, and I wasn't worried. I had done plenty of hikes before. By late afternoon, I found a clearing big enough for my small tent. The ground was covered in dry needles, and the trees around it formed a natural wall that blocked most of the wind. I set up my tent, laid out my sleeping bag, and cooked a little pasta on a small burner I carried. When the sun dropped behind the ridge, the forest shifted. The air cooled quickly, the cicadas quieted, and the shadows became sharp and heavy. I lay down in the tent with my book and flashlight. It was quiet except for the rustling of leaves, but I could still hear faint sounds, branches cracking far off, the low creak of trees moving in the wind, a dog barking down in the village. I wasn't scared, but I was alert. Being alone in the woods always puts your senses on edge. It was close to midnight when I noticed the first odd thing. I had just turned off my flashlight to try and sleep when I heard a sound. Footsteps. Not the random snap of a branch under a falling cone or the scratching of some animal. These were measured, heavy, one after another, slowly moving through the forest. My stomach tightened. I held my breath, waiting. The steps were not close, maybe 50 or 60 meters away, but they were steady, and whoever it was wasn't in a hurry. I told myself it was probably a hunter or maybe even a villager checking traps, though it seemed late for that. After a few minutes, the footsteps faded. I lay awake for a long time after that, staring at the thin fabric of my tent, listening to the silence. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because I woke up suddenly with my heart pounding. I didn't know what woke me, but the forest was dead quiet, not even wind in the branches. I reached for my phone to check the time. It was 3:17 a.m. I turned the screen off quickly, not wanting the light to show through the tent. That's when I noticed another sound, breathing. It wasn't mine. It was faint, coming from outside, maybe only a few feet from the tent wall. It was slow, steady breathing, the kind a person makes when they're standing still. Every hair on my arms lifted. I didn't move. I didn't even dare swallow. My brain started racing. What if someone from the village had followed me? What if they had been watching me since I arrived? The breathing went on for what felt like forever. Then slowly it stopped. I lay frozen, every muscle cramped, until the first hint of dawn light crept into the fabric of the tent. When I finally unzipped it and looked outside, the clearing was empty. Nothing looked disturbed, though I noticed faint impressions in the dry needles a few feet from the tent, like someone had been standing there. I packed up quickly, telling myself I was being paranoid, but something in me refused to go straight back to the village. I decided to walk deeper into the hills, take a different path, and circle back later in the day. By late morning, I found another small clearing by a rocky outcrop. Felt more hidden, further from trails. I dropped my pack and rested, though I couldn't shake the unease from the night before. I stayed there the whole afternoon, sketching in my notebook, boiling water for coffee, trying to relax. But around dusk, as the light started thinning, I noticed something that froze me again. Across the clearing, maybe 30 yards away between the trees, was a man. He was standing completely still, half hidden in the shadows. He wore dark clothes, a cap pulled low, and I couldn't make out his face. He didn't move. He didn't wave or call out. He just stood there, watching me. I tried to convince myself it was a hiker, maybe even a shepherd, but nothing about the way he stood made sense. He wasn't carrying gear. He wasn't walking. He was just fixed on me, silent. I packed my things slowly, pretending not to notice him, heart hammering so hard I thought it would burst. When my backpack was ready, I slung it on and walked casually toward the opposite side of the clearing. I didn't look back until I was halfway down the slope. When I finally turned, the man was gone. The hike down was a blur. My legs felt weak, my mouth was dry, and I kept glancing over my shoulder. Every rustle made me flinch. By the time I saw the village roofs through the trees, the sun had set and the streetlights were glowing faintly. I didn't stop in St. Girons. I walked straight through the quiet streets and waited at the bus stop until the first bus came, long before sunrise. I don't even remember the ride back to Toulouse. I just remember sitting with my pack clutched to my chest, staring out the window, replaying the image of that man standing in the trees, watching. I never camped alone again after that. I still think about it sometimes, who he was, what he wanted, how long he had been following me. Maybe he was just curious. Maybe he was dangerous. The part that unsettles me most isn't seeing him. It's remembering the sound of his breathing, just a few feet from where I slept, in the dark woods of France. I was 24 when I decided to spend a few days camping alone in the Appalachian Mountains in early October 2018. I'd been working non-stop that year and wanted to get away from everything. No phone, no work, no people. I planned it for weeks, checked weather reports, marked the trails on a map, and packed enough food and gear to last me. The first 2 days were calm. The weather was cool, the leaves were turning orange and red, and the nights were quiet. Felt like exactly what I needed. But the third night changed everything. That morning, the air had been heavy and gray. The forecast I checked before leaving hadn't called for rain. But as I packed up my small day pack to hike further up the ridge, I could smell it coming. The kind of thick smell that tells you the sky's about to open. By afternoon, I could hear the distant rumble of thunder, low and rolling. I decided I should make camp before it got worse. I found a small flat clearing just off the trail, near a line of tall pines that gave some cover from the wind. I set up my tent quickly, my hands moving fast because I could feel the first sprinkles hitting the back of my neck. By the time I finished tightening the rainfly, the storm broke. The rain came down hard, fat drops slamming against the tent, the wind pushing the trees so they groaned. I crawled inside, soaked, and sat on my sleeping bag listening to it all. I told myself it was just weather. I had a good tent, a decent spot, nothing to worry about. But then I heard something that wasn't rain. It was faint, almost lost in the noise of water hitting nylon and the wind rushing through the trees. A crunch, like footsteps on wet leaves. I froze, listening. Another crunch, then silence. I told myself it could be a branch falling, or maybe just water dripping heavy in one spot. I didn't move for minutes, just sat still, listening hard. The rain kept pounding, steady now, and I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Then came another sound, closer this time. A dragging scrape like something heavy moving over wet ground. It lasted only a second, then stopped. My stomach tightened. I thought of bears, but the sound didn't fit. Bears don't drag things slowly like that. I turned off my headlamp and sat in the dark. I thought if I kept still, whatever it was would go away. The storm was so loud, I knew I wouldn't hear much else unless it got closer. And then, almost as if it had been waiting, I heard it again. The sound of weight pressing into the wet leaves, slow and deliberate. Not rushing, not curious, but moving at a steady pace. Step, pause, step. It wasn't far from my tent now. I gripped the handle of the small hatchet I kept by my bag. My heartbeat was so hard I felt it in my throat. The footsteps circled slowly around me, too measured to be an animal. They stopped once, right by the backside of the tent, close enough that I could hear water dripping from whatever it was onto the ground. I sat frozen, every muscle tight, barely breathing. Minutes passed. The steps moved again, fading away toward the trees. I waited, my hands still on the hatchet, until the rain softened and the thunder grew distant. By then, I couldn't tell if I had been imagining things or if someone had actually been there. The storm made every sound confusing. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me down. I didn't sleep well, waking at every noise, but by morning the rain had stopped. The forest looked normal, wet and glistening under a pale sun. I stepped out of the tent and checked around. The ground was too soft to ignore what I saw. Clear boot prints, bigger than mine, pressed into the mud. They circled my tent in a wide loop, then disappeared back into the woods. My stomach dropped. It wasn't an animal. Someone had been out there. I packed up faster than I ever had in my life. I shoved wet gear into my bag without caring how heavy it would be. I didn't eat breakfast, didn't take the usual time to check my map. I just wanted out. Every sound in the forest felt sharper. Every gust of wind made me turn my head. As I started back down the trail, I noticed something else. Broken branches at eye level, fresh, not weathered. Someone had passed through recently. Twice I thought I heard movement behind me, but when I stopped and listened, I couldn't see anything. The forest was thick, and if someone wanted to follow me, they wouldn't have to be close to stay hidden. The hike back that should have taken 3 hours took me less than 2 because I pushed myself hard. My legs burned, and my lungs ached, but I didn't stop. When I finally reached the gravel lot where I had parked my car, relief hit me so hard I almost dropped my pack. There were no other cars there, no sign of anyone. I tossed everything into the back seat and got inside, locking the doors before I even started the engine. I sat there for a long moment, catching my breath, staring into the tree line. The woods looked calm, the kind of calm that would normally make me feel at peace. But not that day. Driving out, the mud spraying up behind my tires, I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone stepping out of the trees, watching me leave. But the road stayed empty, winding down toward the small town at the base of the mountains. I didn't go back to the mountains for a long time after that. When friends asked why, I never told them the full story. I just said the weather had been bad, and I'd cut the trip short. The truth was harder to explain. It wasn't the storm that drove me out. It wasn't the rain or the thunder or the dark. It was knowing that on that rainy night, far up the ridge where no one should have been, someone had walked in circles around my tent, slow and careful, while I sat inside too afraid to move. I can still hear the sound of those footsteps on wet leaves if I think about it long enough. And that's the last memory I have of camping alone.